Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I'm Jessica Kennedy, the educator for adult learning here at the St. Louis Art Museum. I'm so happy to welcome you to the museum for tonight's Joanne and Alan Cohen lecture presented by the Frank Lloyd Wright House in Ebsworth Park. Since 2008, our two institutions have worked together to present an annual lecture on the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. Of course, due to the pandemic, it's been a few years since we've had the honor of hosting this event, so we are all very excited to see you this evening. Following the lecture, our speaker will take questions from the audience. Just raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone to you. Also, I do want to remind you that the museum is open until 9 p.m., so I invite you to visit the galleries after the presentation if you are so inclined. To get us started, I'd like to welcome to the stage Catherine Felt, the Executive Director of the Frank Lloyd Wright House in Ebsworth Park, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Jessica. It's good to be here, and there's no doubt that it's because of the partnership with the Art Museum that we've been so successful with this event. I'd like to recognize a few people here who made tonight possible. First, thank you to our members. Funding from our membership program enables this lecture and pretty much everything else that we do, and I can thank them directly because they have the VIP seats right in front. Thank you to Missouri Humanities, an organization that creates connections with people, places, and ideas that shape our society. Missouri Humanities contributed funding for tonight's program. And a big thank you to all of you who are here tonight. The reason our organization exists is because people like you who are intellectually curious, lifelong learners, and interested in Frank Lloyd Wright, architecture, and design. For those of you who are regulars to this event, and I'm going to test your powers of observation here, you may have noticed that there's something different about this year's lecture. Our event has a new name. It is my great privilege to announce that this lecture has been named in honor of Joanne and Alan Cohen. Although Joanne could not be with us tonight, it is because of her determination, resourcefulness, and tenacity that we're all here. Joanne, with Alan as her wingman, ensured that the Krause House was protected, expertly preserved, and that quality educational programming was at the heart of our mission. It was her idea that we host an annual event where scholars, innovators, and thought leaders in architecture and design could share their ideas and work. Joanne was very touched that this event would be named in her and Alan's honor, and she is most certainly here with us tonight in spirit. Michael Cohen, Joanne's nephew, is here tonight to represent the Cohen family. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to call your attention to a piece of paper you have in your possession that was handed to you on the way in. Now, please do not stick it under your seat and do nothing with it. We are very interested in your feedback about tonight's lecture and would like to stay in touch with you in ways that are meaningful to you. So please complete the form and hand it to a staff person on the way out. And just as an added incentive, we are going to draw from all the completed surveys a name, and that person will get a book on the house and a parallelogram box full of goodies from our museum store. So don't forget to fill out that form. I can't think of a better speaker to have at our first named lecture than Dr. Jennifer Gray. Dr. Gray is an architectural historian and director of the Taliesin Institute at the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. She studies modern architecture and how designers and activists use architecture, cities, and landscapes to advance social and spatial justice at the turn of the 20th century. She recently curated 2 exhibitions and produced 2 catalogs on Wright, including Frank Lloyd Wright at 150, Unpacking the Archive at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. She teaches at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University and is the former curator of Drawings and Archives at Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library. Her work has been published in journals of architectural history and critical heritage. She is currently collaborating on an exhibition project celebrating the 100th anniversary of Wright's Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. Dr. Gray previously taught at MoMA and Cornell University. She received her PhD from Columbia University. Way to make us all feel like slackers, Jennifer. We're very happy to have you, Jennifer. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and I know it's a bit redundant, but I also want to thank the Frank Lloyd Wright House at Ebsworth Park, as well as everyone here at the St. Louis Art Museum for this opportunity. I'm having a great time. I'm a little embarrassed to admit this is my first time to St. Louis, and it's really an amazing city. There's amazing architecture and just cultural energy, and it's just very exciting. So I just wanted to thank everyone once again. And with that, I'll get started. Wait, let me put on the PowerPoint. Everywhere or Nowhere, Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City. On April 15, 1935, in the heart of Rockefeller Center in New York, Frank Lloyd Wright mounted an exhibition featuring a radical project called Broadacre City, in which he proposed to eliminate cities and disperse the entire population of the United States onto individual homesteads spread across the country. A veritable Trojan horse that challenged the very urbanity of the space where it was exhibited, Broadacre City advanced an idea of decentralization, whereby communities would be based on small-scale farming and manufacturing, local government, and property ownership. Conceived at the height of the Great Depression, Wright never intended to build Broadacre City, but rather used it as a vehicle to address pressing social, economic, and environmental issues, many of which have contemporary relevance. His vision invites us to reflect on questions of our own time, such as the role of government, social and economic equality, infrastructure and sustainability, and how to foster community. Broadacre is perhaps best described as a thought experiment about an ideal democratic society that took several different forms over 3 decades. Wright first articulated the concept in a series of lectures given at Princeton University in 1930, which he subsequently published in 1931 as Modern Architecture, being the Kahn Lectures. Just 1 year later, in 1932, Wright published his first book-length treatise on the subject, The Disappearing City. At this stage, Broadacre was not yet a design, but only a verbal construct, indicative of its utopian character. Wright first attempted to give his theory tangible form during the winter of 1934-35, encouraged by the department store owner Edgar J. Kaufman, who would soon after commission Wright to design Falling Water. A rare sketch in Wright's archive depicts his initial vision for what Broadacre's form might take. But the concept is still heavily dependent on text, with scrawled notes ringing the perimeter of the drawing and filling entirely the backside of the paper. From these ideas, Wright's apprentices constructed a physical model of Broadacre for an imaginary site. The 12-foot by 12-foot model was composed of 4 sections that together depicted 4 square miles of Wright's ideal city. According to Edgar Toffel, one of Wright's apprentices, the Broadacre model was not conceived as an actual design, but rather was meant to be more diagrammatic. Accompanying the main model were more detailed models. Wright called them collateral models, built at larger scale to illustrate certain components of the overall scheme, such as a prefabricated farm unit and a highway intersection. And I'm showing you here the prefabricated farm unit. Many of these models have survived, and so they're part of the archive, and they're being housed at MoMA at the moment, but we can still see many of these objects. In April 1935, these models, together with a rendered site plan, traveled to New York to be exhibited in an industrial arts exposition at Rockefeller Center, and later toured to Madison, Wisconsin, Pittsburgh, and Washington, D.C. In subsequent years, Broadacre and many of the collateral models would resurface in various other exhibitions. After World War II, Wright revised and expanded The Disappearing City and published it in 1945 as When Democracy Builds, which he illustrated with photographs of the now complete models. Toward the end of his life, Wright revised the project yet again, this time as The Living City, published in 1958. This final iteration of Broadacre City included sweeping perspective drawings showing different and more detailed views of the imaginary scheme. In them, one can see that Wright imagined Broadacre populated with buildings of his own design, many of them unrealized projects, leading some historians to dub Broadacre an architectural graveyard. And actually, you might notice the really tall skyscraper in the center. That's his design for a mile-high skyscraper that he imagined might be plopped down on the Gold Coast in Chicago. So very ambitious graveyard here, if we want to call it that. Together, these components of Broadacre, lectures, publications, models, and drawings, tell the story of Wright's vision for a future America. In place of cities, Wright imagined that people would live dispersed across the countryside on individual homesteads at a density of about 2.5 people per acre. All the functions of a modern advanced society would be provided, but they were distributed across the landscape rather than centralized in cities. In a rendering of the Broadacre model, Wright included a legend that identifies where such functions would be located in his loosely zoned plan. On the upper right are located larger houses, water supply, a non-denominational place of worship, an arboretum, zoo, aquarium, and what Wright called an automobile objective. So that's all kind of up in this quadrant of the model. To the lower right is a recreational area that includes polo and baseball fields, stables for horseback riding, athletic centers, and a lake. Kind of down here. Along the bottom, following the stream, are little farms, a creamery, and a shopping center. A highway runs along the left side, adjacent to an industrial and manufacturing zone that includes factories, mechanical services, an airplane assembly plant, worker housing, and a motel, all buffered by rows of orchards and vineyards. Oops, I went forward instead of using the pointer. At the center of Broadacre are smaller homes, professional offices and clinics, all surrounding a central school district. And the school district is right here, and this becomes really important, so I just wanted to call our attention to it. Interspersed throughout are gas stations, roadside markets, and cinemas. Connecting this vast network were landscaped highways, which Wright described as a fundamental form of great architecture. It was the job of the architect to remove impediments to the free flow of traffic and to respect the contours and habitat of the larger landscape. Roadside clutter, such as billboards, unsightly sheds, fences, poles, and wires, were to be replaced by, quote, sweeping grades, banked turns, well-considered cuts and fills healed by good planting of indigenous growth, end quote. Instead of grade-level street crossings, Wright proposed highway overpasses to better facilitate the safe passage of multiple lanes of cars moving at high speeds, essentially an interstate before the Federal Highway Act of the 1950s. Automobility was a prerequisite for living in Broadacre City. Like many Americans, Wright was obsessed with the car. He acquired his first automobile in 1909, and over the course of his lifetime, even when in financial distress, which was not uncommon for him, he owned or leased another 84 cars. Most were customized with a coating of Wright's signature Cherokee red, a paint color originally devised for the auto industry, which the architect then applied throughout his architectural and design work. The agency and mobility of driving was, at this time, associated with individualism and democratic freedoms, core values of American identity. Wright even designed several of his own futuristic road machines, as he called them, to crisscross Broadacre. Located at regular intervals along the highways were helipads, where safe, noiseless transport planes and helicopters could take off and land. Wright also designed these flying machines, or air rotors, as he called them, some of which were radio-controlled, not unlike drones today. In these comfortable AirPods, citizens of Broadacre could travel even further distances at faster speeds, hopping on and off at different locations, perhaps not unlike how we might think of hailing a taxi or an Uber. New building types emerged in response to this burgeoning mobile society. Wright reimagined the humble gasoline service station, generally an eyesore, as a well-designed, convenient neighborhood center that provided restaurants, meeting spaces, and restrooms. Motor inns or motels encouraged driving for leisure by providing motorists places to rest along their journeys. Destination spots included what Wright called automobile objectives, such as the one he designed for Gordon Strong in 1924 at Sugarloaf Mountain in Maryland. An imposing concrete ramp straddling the summit, the automobile objective provided drivers the experience of ascending into space while comfortably seated in their cars. With the landscape continuously revolving around them, the car's windshield functioned almost as a cinematic screen. From the top, one could take in views of the surrounding countryside, while embedded in the heart of the structure was a planetarium. Thus, the automobile objective provided views of both terrestrial nature and the cosmos beyond. Motorized transport was also transforming the food industry at this time. Distributed throughout Broadacre City were roadside markets, which Wright imagined not as mere stands for buying food, but as full-service community centers. A traffic flow system around the exterior accommodated deliveries from nearby farms and connected shoppers with valet parking and a gas station. Inside the market were stalls where farmers and gardeners sold their fresh meats, cheeses, produce, and so forth, but there was also a daycare center, beauty parlor, floral shop, restaurant, bakery, delicatessen furniture store, and a model kitchen. Nearby little farm units, as Wright called them, supplied most of the food. Each compact farm combined living quarters with a garage, packing station, silo, stables and pens, and a greenhouse with a mushroom cellar. Together, these roadside markets and little farms operated as a regional food production and distribution system that provided citizens of Broadacre with affordable, locally grown fresh food, a veritable farm-to-table model that is resurging today. The advent of Henry Ford's ubiquitous Model T not only made mass ownership of automobiles possible, but its assembly line production provided a model for other industries, including architecture. Wright designed the farm units to be constructed out of prefabricated sheet steel to lower costs and standardize their production. He applied a similar logic to the little homes, as he described them, in Broadacre City, which he proposed to construct as much as possible with standardized and prefabricated components, including entire bathrooms and kitchens assembled off-site that could be merely plugged into the house when the time arrived. Automobiles even determined the size of the houses in Broadacre, which were categorized according to the number of cars their owners drove, ranging from a modest one-car house up to a five-car house. Stretching across the entire United States, Broadacre City obliterated any conventional distinction between rural and urban spaces, between cities and countryside. New technologies, Wright argued, made such decentralization all but inevitable. Electrification, especially with regards to communication, such as the telegraph, telephone, radio, and television, allowed people to communicate across vast distances. Quote, "So far as communication is concerned, the city may now scatter," wrote Wright. "There is little advantage in a few blocks apart, over 10 miles apart, or 1,000 miles. Steam and the invention of the internal combustion engine had led to new forms of transportation, the automobile, the steamship, the airplane, which enabled people to travel long distances in short periods of time. Wright surmised, quote, "Given mechanical mobilizations, the human sphere of movement immeasurably widens." In short, modern telecommunications and motorized transport revolutionized perceptions of space and time in the early 20th century, in effect making the world a smaller place and allowing people greater freedom to move within it. This change, according to Wright, rendered centralized cities obsolete. Quote, "It is in the nature of universal or ubiquitous mobilization that the city spreads out far and away and thin. It is in the nature of flying that it disappears. It is in the nature of universal electrification that the city is nowhere or everywhere." Broadacre amounted to a scathing critique of big cities as Wright saw them in the 1930s. In The Disappearing City, he spent almost as much time excoriating the urban environment as he did proposing solutions to its problems. Overcrowding, congestion, pollution, crime, and inadequate housing all negatively impacted the health and well-being of people living in cities. Quote, "Native pastimes with the native streams, woods, and fields. This recreation he has traded for the taint of carbon monoxide," Wright complained. Illustrations in the text depict a smoke-clogged New York City skyline, a tangled mass of arterials struggling to transport people into the city, and an aerial view so distant that Wright captioned it, "Find the Citizen." The latter is telling for its political subtext. Wright considered such urban conditions not only unhealthy, but a threat to democracy. More troublesome than the physical environment of cities were the social and economic structures that sustained them and created widespread inequality and poverty. Endless production and consumption generated enormous amounts of money, but it was not equitably distributed and required unsustainable levels of labor to maintain. As Wright argued, the city itself has become a form of anxious rent, the citizen's own life rented. He and his family evicted if he's in arrears or the system goes to smash. Renting, rented, and finally the man himself rent should his nervous pace slacken. Should this anxious lockstep of his fall out with the landlord, the money lord, the machine lord, he is a total loss. To stay in lockstep, to pay up. He hopes for not much more now. Humanity preying upon humanity seems to be the only economic system he knows anything about. When Wright invokes the specter of rent, he not only means money one might pay to lease an apartment or house, though that also would count as rent in his mind, but rather a broader economic system in which the wealthy can profit from the labor of others by virtue of their excess capital. He identifies three main forms of rent: rent for land, rent for money, and rent for ideas. Examples include landlords, who profit from renting extra properties they own; banks, which profit from loaning deposited money and charging interest; investors, who reap dividends by putting their savings in the stock market; and corporations that profit from patenting and otherwise legally protecting the ideas and innovations of their employees. Wright calls this way of making money the unearned increment because it relies on capital accumulation rather than the direct labor of the people earning the money. He locates it in the modern city because this is where such activities tend to concentrate. Moreover, he argues, rent generates an army of white-collar workers to administer it, which only expands the rent system, and with it, inequality. And I wrote down these quotes on the slides because if you read Frank Lloyd Wright, he can be verbose. Armies of high-powered salesmanship came into being to unload the senseless overvalues and overproduction, inevitable to this common machine facility, selling by financing and collecting by threatening and foreclosure, or refinancing and repossession, and now the multifarious laws enacted as complex expedients to make all function together bred, finally, still another white-collar army, the lawyers. It soon became impossible to hold, operate, or distribute land, sell money, or manufacture anything safely without the guide and counsel of these specialists and the extraordinary rules and regulations of this now involute game called machine-age civilization. By today's standards, this picture seems like a familiar way of living, working, and making money, at least for the middle and upper classes. But the widespread emergence of these financial instruments and professions was relatively new at the turn of the century when Wright was formulating his ideas, and the stock market crash of 1929 and ensuing Great Depression highlighted the precarious nature of laissez-faire capitalism and the deep inequalities it created. evidenced by the millions of Americans facing food and housing scarcity in the 1930s. Alarmed by the growing gap between the rich and the poor and the ways it undermined democratic social relations, Wright asks, where in all this is the man who labors out of the earth, essential sustenance for all, and the material riches for industry? Where is the agrarian, the mechanic, the artist, the teacher, the inventor, the scientist, the artisan, the hewers of wood and drawers of water, end quote. Wright set out to solve this problem in Broadacre City and by extension restore democracy to America. If we return to the first time Broadacre City was exhibited at Rockefeller Center in Midtown Manhattan, we see that numerous text panels are included along with the models and drawings. The exhibition was sponsored by the National Alliance of Art and Industry, a Rockefeller-funded initiative that endeavored to educate the public about advances in American industry. At the entrance, a panel introduced the overall theme of Broadacre, decentralization. Actually, I can point out right here. It's a little hard to see, it's the entrance. Once inside the installation, various other didactic panels outlined the main arguments. The future is everywhere or nowhere points to the sweeping nature of Wright's proposal. Out of the ground into the light speaks to the agrarian ideal behind Broadacre, with its tapestry of small farms and houses. It's right there. The argument culminates in two adjacent panels titled A New Freedom for Living in America, and we still have these panels, where Wright enumerates key points that curiously mostly describe things not allowed in this new and free society. Many concern the design of the built environment, such as the elimination of billboards, poles, wires, glaring cement roads, and light fixtures. But several of the new freedoms are political in nature, touching on questions related to economics, public housing, and the role of government versus the private sector. Inscribed as they are with polemics and provocations, these demountable plywood panels operate as a kind of portable wall text or catalog, allowing us to read Broadacre as a social and political position as much as an urban plan. When we unpack them, we see that Wright contextualized Broadacre within a larger discourse that was sounding the alarm about the social, economic, and environmental problems created under industrial capitalism at the turn of the 20th century. Two additional panels provide clues. These vertical markers offer a kind of bibliography to students of Broadacre, and included in the list of names are notable activists and critics of laissez-faire, such as Henry George, Edward Bellamy, and Thorstein Veblen. These reformers were concerned about a broad range of questions related to industrial capitalism, especially the labor exploitation and economic and social inequality that seemed to result from industrialization. There's not enough space here to flesh out all of the connections between Broadacre and the required reading list, as Wright calls it, but we can sketch a few major directions. Like many progressive reformers, Wright was troubled by the human cost of industrialization, monotonous work, unfair labor practices, the widening gap between the rich and the poor, and the list goes on. Wright argued that the machine could solve such problems if used humanely. He imagined that the efficiencies of machine production could reduce the average workday by half, freeing up large amounts of time for the citizens of Broadacre to pursue their own interests while still producing the goods necessary for modern life. Wright had advanced similar arguments as early as 1901 in his lecture, The Art and Craft of the Machine. But he also echoed ideas expressed by Edward Bellamy in 1888 in the best-selling utopian science fiction novel, Looking Backward. Bellamy imagines a future society set in the year 2000 in which the problems created by industrialization and capitalism are solved through social coordination. For example, the state owns and manages all production to ensure that the goods of society are equally distributed to its citizens. Working hours are drastically reduced, and everyone retires with full benefits. Sounds great. For Wright, consumption was as much a part of the problem as production, an idea advanced in 1899 by Thorstein Veblen in his seminal text, The Theory of the Leisure Class. Writing about Broadacre decades later in 1940, Wright still criticized society for its obsession with consuming goods, which only perpetuated the dehumanizing cycle of endless production and labor exploitation. Quote, "Let's face it, what we have is commercialization, not civilization," Wright said. The most important progressive reformer on the reading list is arguably Henry George, because this is where Wright's theories about rent and the unearned increment originated. George had published a groundbreaking and best-selling study on poverty and inequality in 1879 called Progress and Poverty, in which he attempted to understand why poverty accompanies economic and technological progress, even when there's a concentration of wealth, as in large cities. Seeing how land values were correlated to social and technological advances, George proposed a single tax on land, which he defined as, quote, "all natural materials, forces, and opportunities, and everything that is freely supplied by nature." This would solve the poverty problem in his mind. The tax would be high enough to end other taxes. It would provide limitless beneficial public investment in services such as transportation and education, and it would provide social services such as a universal basic income. George also argued that a land value tax would end urban sprawl, tenant farming, and homelessness. Wright was skeptical that the single tax alone could solve such intractable social and economic problems, but he nevertheless agreed with George's theory that inequities in land ownership was one of the root causes of poverty. To abolish all rent in Broadacre, Wright proposed to give at least 1 acre of land, or more according to need, to every citizen of his utopia. Quote, "Broadacre City is predicated on the basis that every man, woman, and child in America is entitled to own an acre of ground so long as they live on it or use it," end quote. So property ownership then was the backbone of Broadacre. Land holdings were only as large as a person or family needed, no more, and owners were required to use or improve their land, not hold it in reserve for real estate speculation. Owners could use their property as a residence, but also as a place of business or a small farm. Neither banks nor the government could threaten an individual's homestead. It was sacrosanct. In Wright's mind, the security that land ownership conferred, in the form of capital, housing security, and the ability to grow food, solved the poverty crisis because subsistence was guaranteed. It also solved labor exploitation because workers were thus empowered to reject disagreeable employment conditions. The privately owned house was central to this agenda. After the Great Land Reform had made property available for everyone, the urban factory worker would move to the countryside and, with her former rent money, purchase and assemble the essential components of a mass-produced house. These components were flexible enough to be put together in different ways, allowing owners to express their individuality. Emancipated from rent, Wright explains, the citizens of Broadacre would accrue savings that allowed them to make improvements to their property, add on to their houses, tend to their gardens, and install new kitchens, bathrooms, and waste systems. This bootstrapping aided by mass production that lowered the price of goods. With a minimum of 1 acre of land, families could plant gardens and sell their extra produce at the roadside markets, thereby earning extra income and also contributing to healthy diets of organic, unprocessed food. The outcome was that the worker would cease to be a propertyless proletariat. The world of concentrated wealth and power would be replaced by one in which the means of production would be widely held. Quote, "Where is your poor man now?" Wright asks. No longer poor. Wright also proposed to retool the monetary system to reduce even further the amount of rent in Broadacre. Credit would be socialized, created and controlled by the state for defense, public works, and all social services. A national dividend would replace relief programs and Social Security, while a controlled just price would replace market determinations for all necessary goods. In this way, according to Wright, quote, "Money will become a medium of exchange, of distribution, and not a commodity in the hands of private firms to be let out on hire." Wright derived many of his ideas about monetary reform from a Swiss economist named Silvio Gesell, also honored on the Broadacre panels, who himself was a follower of Henry George. Gesell, whose writings were enjoying a revival in the 1930s, proposed a form of perishable currency, whereby banknotes issued at the beginning of the year would lose a fixed percentage of its face value by the end of the year. Since this money effectively lost value, not unlike perishable goods, it would discourage capital accumulation and thus reduce interest or rent on money, as Wright termed it. Such sweeping changes demanded that Wright rethink the role of government. First, it was vital to eliminate politics from government. Quote, "Politicians dare not really lead," Wright argued, since they were more concerned about negotiating quote unquote money miracles on behalf of interest groups that only maintained the status quo in order to get reelected. Critical of big government and bureaucracies, Wright proposed that each county in Broadacre had just one minor government, the county seat, which worked directly with the national government. The county seat is housed in a functional high-rise building by the side of a lake, accessible but not the focus of the community. Because this arrangement was local and direct, it arguably encouraged public participation in the political process and thus was arguably more democratic. Wright further limited the powers of the state to the business administration of social necessities only where private interests ceased to function effectively. Services such as fire and police protection, banking and money, construction and maintenance of shared infrastructure, such as the highways, and mail delivery were among the public needs that Wright conceded to government. But the most important power of the state was in its capacity as realtor. Land, the backbone of wealth and freedom in Broadacre, was distributed by the state with the assistance of the county architect. This would have amounted to a major redistribution of wealth along socialist lines, even as it conferred an inordinate amount of power to the architect, prompting one historian to dub Broadacre an architocracy. If Wright sought to minimize the role of government in Broadacre, the reverse is true with education. Occupying the heart of the Broadacre model is the school district, physically centered to indicate its critical role in Wright's ideal society. Like everything else in Broadacre, schools were local and small scale, having at most 40 students for the whole school, not the classroom. Wright excoriated formal education, standardized exams, and the general mass production of education through school systems, calling public schools knowledge factories designed to churn out future wage earners who unquestionably accepted the social and economic status quo. Quote, "Public schools, the big American knowledge factory, the big school, the big anything was always a self-defeating institution. How like one of the mere factories of the Industrial Revolution our schoolhouses look as one passes through American towns and villages. They are as utterly unimaginative as they look, and if possible, even more spiritually impotent. Prison houses for the Western mind," end quote. Wright's solution was smaller schools, individualized instruction, and pedagogical techniques based on direct observation, experimentation, and play. In a move many today would applaud, he also argued that teachers in this new educational system should be the best paid workers in Broadacre, because education was fundamental to democracy. Quote, "The teacher in the free city, if it wishes to remain free, would be the most important member of society," Wright argued. Wright derived these concepts from his deep involvement in progressive educational reform as it was being practiced in Chicago and the Midwest at the turn of the 20th century. His aunts had founded the widely regarded Hillside Homeschool in 1886 that used its grounds, the gardens, cultivated plots, animals, and surrounding countryside, to implement an experimental curriculum based on hands-on learning. Students took courses in mathematics, literature, and history, but they also took manual training courses such as bookbinding, metalworking, stenciling, and design, as well as art and physical education. Nature study was essential to the curriculum, and students took long excursions into the countryside to collect specimens such as rocks, minerals, fossils, insects, and birds, which were then preserved in the school museum. This fieldwork supported scientific study in zoology, agriculture, geology, climate, botany, and so forth. Hillside prefigured John Dewey's more well-known laboratory school that he established at the University of Chicago in 1895, which was based on pre-industrial patterns of education whereby children learned about agriculture, chemistry, bookkeeping, arithmetic, and so forth by helping their families at home, on the farm, and in the workshop. Wright would ultimately synthesize these ideas when he founded his own school of sorts called the Taliesin Fellowship in 1933. Ostensibly an architecture school, the fellowship is perhaps more accurately described as a community of people who lived, learned, and worked together. The curriculum included architecture and design work, but also farming, gardening, cooking, construction, weaving, and other learn-by-doing activities. So central was progressive education to Wright that he even included a Taliesin equivalent in Broadacre City. It should be pointed out that most of the social and political theories Wright referenced in Broadacre originated in the late 19th century, not during the Great Depression when Broadacre was conceived. Wright insisted that citizens of his utopia must work and use their own faculties rather than, quote, sitting around waiting for their own government to feed them, think up jobs for them, pat them on the back, or put them in the workhouse, end quote. This indictment of New Deal programs and the emerging welfare state, the historical context of Broadacre itself, is made more complicated by the fact that Wright claimed to be completely loyal and sympathetic to Franklin D. Roosevelt's quote-unquote vain endeavor, Wright called it, to save the capitalist system with these programs. The Broadacre exhibition toured to Washington, D.C. with the expressed aim of advancing Wright's ideas to the president in the hopes of securing the architect a planning job with the Resettlement Administration to design greenbelt towns. Moreover, Wright was not anathema to nationalizing, at least temporarily and partially, the resources of the country, as evidenced by the sweeping land reform project that is at the core of Broadacre. Indeed, Wright traveled to the Soviet Union in the late 1930s and returned with some positive reactions to the new social and economic order he encountered there. How can all of this be reconciled? One possibility is that the social and economic programs advanced by Roosevelt in the 1930s did not go far enough to satisfy Wright. They were progressive patches to ameliorate the problems of an economic and social system left mostly intact. They also were administered by an increasingly large centralized government, which threatened Wright's vision of locally run democratic institutions. Wright's vision was much more radical, even as it was inherently conservative in its defense of private property and individualism. He implied as much when he described Broadacre as an entirely new mode of living. Quote, new form, not reform, is our fundamental need in America. Another explanation for this time warp between the 19th century and the 1930s might be Wright's own personal history and life. In 1932, concurrent to working out Broadacre City and establishing the fellowship, Wright published a book titled An Autobiography, a summary and defense of his experiences both personally and professionally. The autobiography begins with a lyric depiction of the family farm in Spring Green, Wisconsin, where he was born in 1867, and ends with his future vision for Broadacre. These two agrarian tableaux, both celebrating the values of family, economic security, and contact with the land, form the prologue and epilogue to the story of Wright's life. Born into a farming family, Wright's childhood was spent in agricultural communities. Farming at this time was considered a virtuous activity, an association sanctioned by Wright's uncle, both a farmer and well-regarded Unitarian minister, Jenkin Lloyd Jones. In a series of sermons he delivered on topics such as plowing, sowing, weeding, reaping, reforestation, and barn building, which he collected under the title The Gospel of the Farm. His mother's family, Wright's mother's family, I should say, the Lloyd Joneses, were a tight-knit, successful clan who provided Wright with the model of an independent, self-sufficient family who worked the land, a model all the more imperative when Wright's parents divorced. As an adult with a successful architecture practice, Wright also would divorce and return to the family compound in Wisconsin to build Taliesin, his home, studio, and farm, where he attempted to recreate the security cultivated by the Lloyd-Jones family. Life at Taliesin combined rural living with intellectual pursuit, thus tapping into a rich tradition of American gentleman farmers, such as Thomas Jefferson, and transcendentalist philosophers, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson. Indeed, the term cultivated applies to both Taliesin and its owner, Wright, as it bridges the distinction between culture and agriculture. The tremendous burden Wright places on the family unit in Broadacre City as the primary source of economic, spiritual, physical, and intellectual sustenance might be explained by his formative experiences with the Lloyd-Joneses. In this way, Broadacre City is deeply personal for Wright and could be seen as a return to origins as much as a vision for the future. So, what can Broadacre teach us today? In the 1930s, critics lambasted Broadacre as simultaneously communist, fascist, and socialist. Others seized upon its impossibility as an urban plan or social organization. Wright himself admitted, quote, "As for craft, statecraft is not my craft," end quote. Today, Broadacre City is often misunderstood as a call for suburbanization due to its sprawling nature, dependence on automobiles and freeways, and a singular focus on private property. Though fair, these critiques miss the progressive nature of Wright's proposal. Not readily visible in the models and drawings of Broadacre is its social agenda, Wright's concerns about questions related to democracy, education, social and economic equality and security, and more. Today, we find ourselves facing many of the same problems Wright tried to address in Broadacre City. How can we address the widening gap between the rich and the poor? How can we reform government to better meet our collective needs? How can we overcome our differences to create fair and inclusive communities? Broadacre City cannot be marshaled wholesale to answer these questions. The solutions Wright advanced are not practical and in many cases have glaring blind spots. Wright does not, for example, discuss the intersections of race or gender and how these play into poverty, disenfranchisement, and inequality. His arguments center almost entirely on class. Though Wright alternately states that Broadacre is for individuals and families, he overwhelmingly emphasizes nuclear families with children in his narrative, the unsaid expectation being that a woman is probably at home caretaking the family while a man works. The number of children needed to sustain the independent human farming practices Wright envisioned invites further questions about family planning, feminism, and reproductive rights. A bachelor briefly makes an appearance in Broadacre, with Wright suggesting new domestic arrangements that might, quote, take the curse off domesticity for men who cannot tolerate its monotony. But women are not granted such freedoms. More recently, historians have pointed to the inherently racist assumptions underlying any system based on private property, given its barriers to entry, now and certainly in the 1930s. Nor was Wright's condemnation of cities entirely accurate or fair. Today, we understand cities as dynamic environments with rich potential for the exchange of ideas, personal growth, and expression of individuality, all values Wright was trying to promote through his decentralized Broadacre City, I should add, as well as offering a more sustainable pattern of living through density, shared public services, and mass transportation. Whatever its shortcomings, however, Broadacre is remarkable as a thought experiment. Wright attempted to grapple with the most challenging and intractable questions of his time, questions that linger today. Broadacre was, in many ways, Wright's theory of everything, and so the lessons we can take from it vary with context and circumstance. But perhaps for our current moment, a time of deep polarization, some lessons we can take away from Broadacre are less about its specific architectural forms or this or that economic policy, but more broadly about his commitment to trying to do something about the problems society faced. We may disagree with the solutions Wright proposed in Broadacre City, and he himself once remarked that he could never be accused of presenting a plan for immediate use. But I would like to suggest that perhaps it is his questions, not the answers, that make Wright of continued relevance to our own time. Thank you. And I think we're going to have some time for Q&A, and they're going to bring microphones, so just, yeah.
Go ahead and.
Hello, hello. This one's working.
Yes. Oh, here we go. All right, right down here. Do you mind passing? Just, sir.
Model, and will it ever be displayed?
So the question is, where is the model and will it ever be displayed? The model is currently at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's part of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation archives, which were at Taliesin West in Arizona until about 2012, I believe. It took 5 years to move everything, but the archive is now at Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library at Columbia and at the Museum of Modern Art. So it's an unusual arrangement that there's two stewards of it. The reason for doing that is that MoMA has the facilities to handle three-dimensional models and create them and all that kind of stuff. Avery is an archive that handles primarily paper-based materials, so it's a shared archive. So it's been totally conserved, it's in great shape. It was displayed in 2014 at a small show called Density versus Dispersal at MoMA. And then I believe it was shown, it's going to be shown, I should say, next year, I think. I don't know the exact date, but I know that the curators at MoMA are planning to do a show around Broadacre City. So it's around and it will be on display. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right down here again.
It was a very interesting lecture, and I wondered, is it available online to be downloaded?
We recorded it, and so I believe we will make it available online. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I can repeat it, or, sorry. The question is, has there ever been discussion about a movie about Broadacre City? Not that I know of. There is film showing the apprentices making the model in the archive. We've done some kind of 3D rendering, like fly-throughs on the computer very recently that kind of show it as it might look today, which we're actually going to animate for this exhibition we're doing about the Imperial Hotel. It's included in there, and we weren't able to borrow the model because it's so expensive to ship it across the world, but we're going to use this kind of digital rendering. So there's some stuff like animations, but I don't know of like a full-on movie. That's a good question. There was one.
On the panels that, the two panels that we're showing at the initial display of Broadacre City, there were the Wright's commandments were listed.
Yeah.
Each one started with the word no. And the top one and the bottom one seemed to be circular. It said no private, I can't remember what they were, and you might be able to bring it back. But I'd like to know what, there it is. No private ownership of public needs, no public ownership of private needs. Can you compare and contrast what that means?
So Wright, one of his theories was that certain needs of the community needed to be handled by the state because they were shared by everyone. So the highways are obviously, critical to getting around Broadacre City, and so the state should pay for, and we should collectively take care of the highways. Your home, for example, was your private space, and you were meant to kind of fix it up and add on and things like that to improve your property. So he's basically just, as we are still kind of have these debates today, right? I mean, it's very current. He's trying to figure out like which things in society are best provided by private investment versus public investment. So that's what he means there. And for him, he wants to limit the state's involvement in these things as much as is reasonably possible to provide more to the individual private property owner. So he's just trying to figure out what that line is. But shared services like fire, police and safety, national defense, that was for the state because those were collective needs. Does that help? Yeah, I mean, one thing that with Broadacre that's interesting, I mean, it's a thought experiment, and so he doesn't drill down into very granular details about everything. So every time I try to dig into this, I'm like, well, how would that actually work? Or what about this that he didn't talk about? So I think that one thing to keep in mind with Broadacre is that he's trying to think about these big picture questions, but he doesn't usually arrive at some, perfect answer, and he doesn't dig into details necessarily. So it can be a bit challenging in that way. They're like, how would that actually work, And oftentimes the answer is it wouldn't.
All right, we have one more question right over here.
Yeah, a quick question. We have a house in Seaside, Florida, which is basically similar to what Frank did. Newtown is the same kind of thing. Is it all following the same pattern?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Is it?
Does Newtown and Seaside follow the Frank Lloyd Wright ideas?
I don't know. I hadn't thought about that. These are planned communities that have kind of a mixed use, program to them. I don't think that they're more new urbanist. I don't think they probably look back to Broadacre City, but I can see your question because there might be some similarities there. I mean, the idea for Broadacre City is that within that 4 square mile radius, all the things that you would need are there, like the schools, the little factories, whatever else, offices, your house. And so the idea was that you did have this kind of local community within that space, and then that model was just replicated kind of like a network across the entire country. But if you think about like a Seaside or something, it kind of is its own community that offers all these things within a small space that is often pedestrian even. So I hadn't thought about that connection, but that's a good question. I don't know that they were directly looking at Broadacre City. I think it's a more recent new urbanist trend, but there are similarities. Is that the last one? Well, thank you all for coming. I think they're going to take the cane now and pull me off the stage, but but I really appreciate you being here on a Friday night. Thank you.
I just wanted to thank Jennifer again and thank all of you for being here. Thoughtful questions, a lot to think about, and if you have not visited the Frank Lloyd Wright House in Ebsworth Park, we encourage you to do so. Thank you. And fill out your evaluation card, please.